Sometimes the truth doesn't walk into the room quietly. Sometimes it arrives 7 months too late. The divorce courtroom in downtown Dallas was quiet in the slow, ordinary way Tuesday mornings usually were, the soft hum of fluorescent lights blending with the faint scratching of pens and the low murmur of distant conversations drifting through the hallway outside. Daniel Hayes stood near the long oak table beside his attorney, his suit perfectly pressed, his posture calm and composed, at least on the outside. For months he had prepared himself for this moment. Months of silence. Months of paperwork. Months of telling himself that whatever once existed between him and the woman he married had already ended long before the court ever saw their names on a case file. The clock on the wall read 9:14 a.m. The hearing was scheduled for 9:15. One more minute, and everything would finally be official. Daniel glanced down at the folder in front of him where the divorce agreement waited neatly clipped together, each page already reviewed, signed, and finalized on his side. It should have felt like relief. Instead, there was only a strange, hollow stillness sitting somewhere behind his ribs, like a house that had been emptied too quickly. His attorney leaned closer and spoke quietly, reminding him this would be brief, routine, uncomplicated. The judge would confirm the terms, both parties would sign, and by the time they stepped back onto the street outside the courthouse, their marriage would exist only as paperwork in a county archive. Daniel nodded without really listening, because despite everything, his eyes kept drifting toward the courtroom door. She hadn't arrived yet. Olivia Hayes had always been punctual. In fact, punctual was an understatement. Olivia used to say that if you respected people, you respected their time. And yet here they were, 45 seconds before the hearing, and her chair remained empty. Daniel told himself it meant nothing. Traffic. Parking. A last-minute phone call. But a faint knot began tightening in his chest anyway. The bailiff shuffled some documents. The clock ticked forward. 9:15 a.m. Still nothing. His attorney quietly cleared his throat as if preparing to request a short delay, when suddenly the brass door handle at the back of the courtroom turned the room, remained frozen in a silence that felt almost unreal as Olivia slowly lowered herself into the chair beside her attorney, one careful movement at a time, as though the weight she carried was not only physical, but something heavier that had followed her into the courthouse that morning. Daniel still had not moved. His fingers rested against the edge of the oak table, but his mind had drifted somewhere far from the courtroom walls, replaying the image he had just seen over and over again, as if trying to convince himself that it was real. 7 months. The number echoed quietly in his head. 7 months meant something very specific. 7 months meant that the timeline of everything he believed had already collapsed. The judge cleared her throat softly, the sound breaking the tension that had filled the room like thick fog. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at the documents in front of her before glancing toward both attorneys. The hearing was expected to last no more than 15 minutes. Yet suddenly the atmosphere carried the weight of something far more complicated. Olivia kept her gaze lowered, her hands folded gently over the curve of her stomach, as if she were protecting something fragile from the eyes around her. She had always been composed, always calm in difficult situations, but today there was something different about the way she sat there, something quiet and determined beneath the exhaustion on her face. Daniel felt the knot in his chest tighten further. The last time he had seen her in person had been nearly 8 months earlier on a rainy evening outside their home in Highland Park, the house they had bought together when everything still felt possible. He remembered the argument clearly, though neither of them had raised their voices that night. Their marriage had not ended with shouting or anger. It had ended with something far worse. Silence. Weeks of it. Months of distance that slowly stretched between them until it felt easier to sign paperwork than to keep asking questions neither of them knew how to answer. Daniel had told himself that she had chosen to walk away first. Olivia had said she needed space, that she needed time to figure out who she was outside of the life they had built together. At the time he had believed it meant she no longer wanted the marriage. Now as he watched her sitting just a few feet away, the pieces of that memory no longer fit together the way they once had. His attorney quietly leaned closer to him and whispered something about remaining calm and letting the process continue, but Daniel barely heard the words. His attention was fixed on Olivia. For a brief moment, she lifted her eyes, and their gazes met across the table. It lasted only a second, Yet in that single glance, there was an entire history neither of them had managed to. Daniel did not realize he had been holding his breath until the judge finished speaking and the quiet rustle of papers pulled him back into the present moment. The words from the bench had been simple, procedural, almost routine, yet they had shifted the entire atmosphere of the courtroom in a way no one could ignore. The hearing would be postponed. The judge had explained calmly that under the circumstances additional information would need to be reviewed before any final decision could be made regarding the dissolution of the marriage. It was not an accusation, and it was not a judgment. It was simply time. More time than Daniel had expected to spend sitting in the same room as the woman he had once promised to build a life with. The bailiff gathered several folders while both attorneys leaned toward their clients to quietly explain the next steps, but Daniel barely heard the details. His attention remained fixed on Olivia. She still sat with the same quiet posture, one hand resting protectively over the curve of her stomach as if shielding it from the weight of the room. For months, Daniel had imagined what this day would feel like. He had pictured signing the documents, walking out into the Texas sunlight, and finally closing a chapter that had lingered unresolved for too long. Instead, he felt as if the past had suddenly stepped forward and refused to stay buried. Olivia slowly stood from her chair with careful balance, and for a moment Daniel noticed how tired she looked. Not fragile, not weak, but tired in the way someone appears after carrying something important alone for a very long time. Her attorney whispered something to her while gathering the paperwork, and she nodded softly. The small movement reminded Daniel of the countless quiet moments they once shared in their kitchen early in the mornings when the city outside was still waking up. He remembered the smell of coffee, the sunlight through the wide windows of their Highland Park home, and Olivia standing barefoot near the counter reading messages on her phone while he prepared breakfast on Saturdays. Those memories had once felt ordinary. Now they returned with a clarity that made his chest feel unexpectedly heavy. As people began leaving the courtroom, Daniel finally forced himself to stand. The room suddenly seemed smaller than before. Olivia turned slightly toward the aisle as if preparing to leave, but then she hesitated. Their eyes met again across the space between them. This time the silence carried something different. Not anger, not distance, something more uncertain. Daniel took a slow breath and stepped away from the table before his attorney could stop him. Each step toward her felt strangely unfamiliar. As if he were walking towards someone, the courthouse hallway felt strangely louder than the courtroom had been only minutes earlier, filled with the echo of footsteps, quiet conversations, and the distant ringing of an elevator bell somewhere down the corridor. Yet Daniel barely noticed any of it as he stood a few feet away from Olivia near the tall windows overlooking the busy Dallas street below. Sunlight filtered through the glass and spilled across the polished floor, and for the first time since she had walked into the courtroom, he could see her clearly in the daylight. There was no mistaking the truth now. The curve beneath her coat was unmistakable, the gentle, unmistakable sign of a life growing quietly in the months they had spent apart. Daniel felt the weight of realization settle over him slowly, like a storm cloud forming in a clear sky. 7 months meant that the timeline reached back into the final days of their marriage, back into the quiet weeks when their home had become a place filled with distance instead of conversation. Olivia rested one hand against the window ledge as she caught her breath for a moment, her other hand still resting lightly across her stomach. She did not look at him right away, and Daniel could not tell whether that silence was hesitation or something deeper. For years he had believed he understood Olivia better than anyone else in the world. She had always been calm under pressure, thoughtful before speaking, careful with the emotions of others. But now he realized there was an entire chapter of her life that had unfolded without him even knowing it existed. Finally, she turned slightly toward him, her expression composed but tired in a way that made Daniel's chest tighten again. When she spoke, her voice was steady, though softer than he remembered. She explained that she had discovered the pregnancy shortly after leaving the house in Highland Park, only a few weeks after the night their conversation had quietly ended everything between them. At first, she had convinced herself that the distance between them meant it would be easier for both of them if she handled it alone. She said she had watched him bury himself deeper into work, traveling constantly between Dallas and New York, building the technology company he had spent a decade creating. She had not wanted to become another complication in a life that already seemed determined to move forward without her. Daniel listened without interrupting, every word landing heavier than the one before it. The hallway around them continued moving as lawyers and court clerks passed by, yet the space between them felt completely separate from the world outside it. Olivia admitted that as the months passed, she had planned many times.